Okay, now I hope that after we talked a little bit about like flex spaces, you are kind of in a state where you say, yeah, okay, I do understand something, but some stuff is also pretty confusing. Um, and that's perfectly understandable. For one, I'm definitely not explaining this perfectly, but for the other, we are still not there where you can actually understand the full thing, I would say. So to get a little bit deeper, remember I said you should always look at those three properties together because they kind of belong together. You should not isolate them. So in order to isolate them a little bit and to be able to understand what they do on their own, let's now look at the shrink and grow property in more detail. And for that, we will just always have the same flex spaces for those elements and only change the shrink or the grow and see what happens. Now, in this first example, what you see is we just have three elements with the same basis and shrink set to 1. Now, when you have them like that, again, with enough space, nothing actually happens. Now, when I set this to 0, absolutely nothing happens because it kind of doesn't have to shrink yet. It starts to happen when I'm removing space, when the container is getting smaller. And now you can see what happens. Those elements shrink. They shrink as much as they need. You can also see the text is not getting smaller. The font is staying the same. But those elements are allowed to shrink, and they shrink in the same by the same proportions. So they shrink in the same at the same level, kind of. Now they don't have a grow set, so what they do is they get to their preferred size, which is 200 pixels, and that's how they remain. Now in the second row, we have a shrink and a grow property set. And this is not the default setting. The previous setting that we had is the default setting for shrink and grow, shrink 1, grow 0. For this setting, we are having a shrink 1 and a grow 1 on each of those elements. And you see with this, you get this kind of behavior where your elements tend to equally cover the space that is available for them. So when we once again grab the container and make it smaller, they shrink proportionally. They shrink in the same speed, kind of. And when we get bigger, they grow in the same speed. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that when we are getting smaller like this, are we shrinking or are we not shrinking? No, we are not actually shrinking. Those elements have the same base as those elements above. So what is actually happening here is that they were still growing, because if you would turn off their grow, they are just exactly as the elements above. So as long as we had surplus space, too much space, they are growing. That's when they're looking at the grow property. And the moment where we kind of cover, when we reach this threshold where the flex basis is actually reached, the ideal size is actually reached, this is when the shrinking kicks in. So only now when we change the shrink, they would have some different behavior. So that's kind of important to notice. You are not always talking about the element shrinking when there is fewer space. Just because we reduce the space here, this does not mean that the elements are shrinking. This is still touching their grow property. And this is going as long as you reach this flex basis threshold, which we can see because the elements in the row above have exactly the same threshold. And from now on, the elements are actually shrinking. Okay? You can see that pretty nicely when we would, let's just take this element, let's not allow it to grow. Now you can see the middle element is not allowed to grow. It's having enough space to have its flex basis, because the other elements are only allowed to grow as much as this element needs for its flex basis. And now we can see, as long as I am using this space here, the yellow element actually doesn't change. It is having it stays at the same size, which is its flex basis. Now look what happens when we reach this threshold of 200 pixels, where each element has 200 pixels. Now the element is shrinking just as the other ones. Okay, so when we have too much space, the only thing that is interesting is the grow property, and since it doesn't have a grow property set, it doesn't grow. Only when we reach the threshold of the flex basis, now all of the elements are shrinking, because all of them are having a flex shrink of 1.